Hi, everybody. My name is Susana Salazar. I am a student at LSC-Kingwood, and today I have with me Mr. Lupe Mendez, who is a poet, activist, and educator.
Hi, everybody.
So I'm going to be asking Mr. Mendez just a few questions about his work. So the first question, what inspires your writing?
If I had to say on the most basic level, I think it's the opportunity to write poems of witness. So the things that I see on an everyday level, either in basic interactions with individuals, especially in my classroom, and then other opportunities in community building and other activist arenas that I get to have conversation with. Being able to record those instances, like snippets of history that is occurring at the moment, that serves as inspiration. There's a poet friend, Kyle Dogan, that has said that a poem isn't the record of an event, the poem is the event. And so looking at it through that lens, like how can I use that time wisely to write those things that are important?
Cool. Do you have a favorite poem or piece that you have written?
Oh God, a favorite poem of mine?
Yeah.
So there is a piece I wrote, really long title, that was a poke at a priest who had actually been really racist to a student of mine. What did I title it? So the priest who told one of my students that holding a forum the day after the election would do something to Latinos and have them act like savages, something to that extent. But the poem itself was basically one of my students wanted to have create a forum to talk through the election, the last presidential election. And instead of encouraging this conversation, this priest basically said that no, let's not do it because it's too negative, and we wouldn't want the Latinos acting like the people on TV, being savage and burning Trump being at us. And she came back to my room crying, basically saying, how does he view all of us that way? And so I think in a very stick it to him nature, I really like that.
Okay. So tell me about your writing process.
I get hooked on an image, not so much the language, but I get hooked on an image, and if it causes me to push an idea forward that's either jarring or pleasant or smooth, that's what captures that full level. Writing wise, there are some writers who go straight format or form in poetry. I just write, no punctuation. I don't worry about the grammar. I don't worry about the spacing, how the lines look, if I've got stanzas. I just throw it up, and then I'll go back and edit and chip away at it and figure out what the form wants to be or how it needs to come out. It's a very late night process. I'm a night owl, not an early bird, so a lot of the work I do is based on the after hours. Stuff like that.
Okay. So when I went onto your website and I looked up your work, I was able to tell that you're very passionate about immigration and the discriminations that Hispanics deal with. Is activism for equality for Latinos the theme of your work?
I would say in part that, but also a big push towards human condition, but especially the human condition that's somehow being trapped. or isolated or pressed upon or erased, so that because of my experience and my own background, it's going to bring up issues that deal with immigration, and issues that deal with how the indigenous body, how the black body has been affected over all these centuries and years and days, along those lines, if that makes sense.
Okay. Would you say that your work mainly focuses on class, or are there other things like language, identity, assimilation, and acculturation?
I would say, in some rudimentary way, I think I hit on a lot of those particular topics. I'm not a formalist, if that's a thing. I'm not too worried about practicing forms of poetry because I need to practice them. I don't know if it's me being jaded or if I've got a chip on my shoulder, but the idea that I need to be able to write a cinquain, or that I need to engage in a haiku because other poets do it and it's a form that needs to be covered. We've had 7 centuries of old dead white poets writing in form, and eso no me atrae. Like, I don't want to read a poem, of Ode to a Grecian Urn. So I'm going to hit on topics that probably are hitting on what's occurring currently, and then touching back on like historical context. If it ends up touching class, if it ends up touching on issues of feminism, racial identity, activism, those are the very necessary pieces and corners and ideas that haven't been yet talked about in some way. And hopefully I'm able to add those layers into the work.
Okay. How do you consider your art to be activism?
I constantly tell the kids that I work with, especially when we go into a unit where I teach poetry, the very first individuals, whenever there's a revolution, who are charged, jailed, killed, sequestered, tortured, or disappeared, are the clergy, the doctors, the journalists, and the poets. Writing, even if you're writing fiction, even if you're writing poetry, writing is capturing the truth and communicating it to the masses. And the minute you do that in a way that's also artful, you are threatening the individual that wants to be the rule of law, which is nonsense because the world is full of gray. And so that's threatening to folks, and they don't know how to handle it. And so they would rather keep this kind of work quiet and locked away because it's too academic, it's too heady. And I think it's the opposite. I think it's passionate and it's necessary, and it should capture every single individual to move in some way, either physically or spiritually or mentally or emotionally. And so, that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with your activism, what types of things do you participate in, and how much of that do you carry over into your classroom?
Interestingly, there was a point, maybe up until about the election. No, maybe a little bit before the election. I had tried to compartmentalize my activism life, my teacher life, and my poetry life because I didn't want them, touching together. Organizing events for the public to serve community was one thing. Organizing readings and participating in readings was another thing. And then organizing my lessons was totally different. But now in the last few years, the urgency in which I need to be able to discuss these things, now they're starting to bleed in together. And what I'm talking about in my classrooms, what I'm talking about on stage, what I'm talking about when I'm meeting with community members, and they're starting to inform each other in ways that I hadn't expected. So in the last 5 to 6 years, it's been hand over foot, borrowing and researching, and I use all of it across all areas. So whatever I used to do to compartmentalize is now it's a blur. Like it's non-existent. And I think now coming into my 40s, I'm a better writer for it.
Okay. So my next question is how has being Latino helped or hindered your writing?
You know, when I was in college, I took a creative writing class in my undergraduate at the University of St. Thomas. And somebody had said to me, because I had decided to play Spanish in a poem, it was a bilingual poem, and somebody had said, did you ever think about transferring the Spanish into Latin? And I asked, why would I do that? And they said, well, you want to be able to reach a broader audience. And at first it was jarring because I questioned and asked, who the hell reads Latin?
Exactly.
Like, what audience am I? And I was like, but I don't want to, if they're reading Latin, then this is not for you. And so that actually started this conversation about who are we writing for? And for the longest time, I've always tried to keep with the idea that I want to be able to write work that the person who's never read a poem would be willing to engage with. And if I could get somebody like my father, who only has a second grade reading equivalent, if I could engage him even in just the speak of a poem, then I've done the job that I needed to do. My Latinidad has given me access to words and work and writing that I think is on par and even older than anything English can provide. When we look at an American concept of literature, we understand that the classics and the canon are one way, but I go as far as to explain to my students that the first American writer was a Mexican gay nun, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and she was writing in the 1500s in Mexico. And the kids are like, what? And I'm like, so screw Twain, screw Scott Fitzgerald, like all of them, like they ain't got nothing. Like she was writing about topics that are still relevant today. Why can't women be priests in the church today? Why can't, look, the only way that women can be educated is they fight tooth and nail to get that education. Like why? These are still the same topics that we're dealing with today. And that is still relevant. And here you had a woman writing in the 16th century about these things. And we're 500 years later, it's still the same stuff. So yeah, I think it provides me an access to a language and culture that is vastly deep and riveting.
Okay. So how have your experience inspired your activism? Did you ever spend a lot of time in Mexico?
I think, so I grew up in a home that was very much civil service. My father worked for Parks and Recreation. And my mother worked for University of Texas Medical Branch as an LVN nurse. So right away, my dad always fixing things for recreational use, for parks, but he always went to work building something for community. And having worked with him over the weekends to get jobs done that people could use on the daily, right? You don't think that sports and recreational stuff is necessity, but that's an outlet, right? And so I understood the importance of his work. And then my mom's work as a nurse, she worked in a maximum security psychiatric ward. And so mental illness, my mother always had a soft spot and a good heart when it came to how we label individuals. She always told me never refer to anybody as crazy. You don't know exactly what they're going through. Sometimes this stuff can be traumatic. And so I think those became the foundational pieces in terms of what I identified as what activism looks like. That and the fact that my parents are not your stereotypical Mexican family. My mother is 10 years older than my father. She was the breadwinner. She handled all the bills in the house. He did not. She had more of an education than he did. They only had one kid. So, like, even then, both of them were very conscious of the fact that being an only child, I had to learn both sides of everything. And they never shied away from that concept. Like, my dad didn't freak out if my mom sat me down to learn how to sew buttons, because then he would hand me his shirts and he'd like, fix my buttons. And he's like, I'm charging you, but okay. And then I'd go outside and fix, change out the spark plugs, do the oil. But then I'd go inside and, make pozole. And so, like, and it was always this idea that you won't always have us, so you need to learn how to do these things. And it became like a survival tactic. So I think in terms of like activism, I think that's where that foundational piece comes from. Yeah.
And the $1 million question, have you ever thought of running for an office to help make change?
So a couple of years ago, I toyed with the idea. I left teaching public school, and I currently work at Cristo Rey Jesuit College Preparatory Prep on the southeast side. And because I don't work in public school anymore, I could have run for HISD school board on my side of town, on the southwest side of town. And La Ventana estaba allí to go and do that, but I didn't act fast enough to do the paperwork. And the guy who was leaving his position on the school board left an open seat, and there was nobody that contested it. I should have done it, but maybe one day I would like to run for school board and fight that way. I think that makes good sense.
So if you were to run, and what types of changes would you want to see?
I believe the school district's shift needs to be something that recognizes the strengths of a community and allows community members, families specifically, to make decisions on their campuses. And while I was working in HISD years ago, we used to have a committee that sat on each campus where family members could discuss what is it that they and their families need. And then over the years, that got washed out. And so I would try to work towards bringing that back. Transparency with budgets, training principals and teachers to make better decisions in terms of where their money is going, and vetting who are the contract vendors that they're using for the programs that they're using in district, and then finding a damn way to work towards shifting a school district from state mandated testing to project-based learning. I think that's a necessity. There was a point at which almost the whole damn country was in bed with Pearson, and Pearson makes the damn test, but then also sells you the study guide material for the damn test. Like, you're not teaching anybody anything. You're monopolizing an industry. So I would go on record and say I would do anything that I could to call out companies like Pearson that aren't doing the work and just making a dime on the shoulders of children. So that kind of stuff. Much radical.
Okay.
Radical stuff.
So I heard you just recently became a dad. So how has becoming a father changed your writing? And if it hasn't, do you anticipate it changing?
Funny part is I've barely written anything since the baby was born. I've been editing. I haven't written any poetic work. I've written 2 reviews for books that have come out. I've been editing work that I put together, working through anthologies and creating an anthology work for other writers. the time that I've always written in is now sleep or interrupted with like baby cries. I think I'm at the point now, and I'm enjoying fatherhood. I'm okay with taking the break. Like, it hasn't freaked me out. Like, a part of me now, just now, the baby's like, what are we, this is the 22nd? She's 8 days away from being 6 months. So a part of me is like, okay, I need to get back into the groove. I haven't missed it though. Like, I've been reading a lot, enjoying these months with this kid and discovering what she's all about. I haven't been awestruck to write any poems about her, which I'm okay with. Like, some people are like, oh, you should write about your kid. I'm like, no, like, I'm gonna just enjoy this. I'm not gonna use this for exploitative writing. Like, that's not, I ain't got time. So yeah, I think I'm just now at the point where I'm probably going to, I guess, buckle down and be more disciplined about the time that I spend, even if it's only, I used to write like 2-3 hours. And then now if it's only like an hour, it's still okay. So yeah.
Okay. And your wife is a writer as well. Do you guys collaborate often?
We just finished a 2-person workshop and reading at University of Houston downtown in October. We don't normally collaborate often, A, because our schedules are crazy, but also B, we have completely different writing styles. She can envision a poem in her head, and then when she writes it out, it's already formulated, like format and everything. And she's just editing when she does that. And I'm not that visual. Like, it takes me a little while to get to it. So she's already created these things and put them together, and I'm not there yet. She does not like the way I write, and she freaks me out. So
that was my next question. Is she more critical of your work, or do you critique her more?
We critique each other evenly. Like, we're always like, I constantly fall in love with the language and the images that she uses, and so a lot of the critiques I give her, like, did you think of this as a framework to write with that? And in the reverse, she's more critical of, is that where I wanted to end with the piece? And so there's different pushes in the way that we help each other with the writing. Yeah, in that regard, yeah. I think that's where we best fit.
Okay. And so the final question, what do you want your legacy to be?
A hardworking poet, a hardworking writer. Like, I want to be able to have folks speak about how supportive I was in building community of writers, and then for my own work as well. Hopefully being a leading voice as a Gulf Coast poet. I think that's one of those things that we don't have access to. We're constantly, like, in the writing community, you hear about all the names that come out of New York and all the names that come out of Fresno, and there's very few names that come out of the Texas Gulf Coast, and so I want that to be something that I help put that flag in the ground and say, hey, we're here too. So, yeah.
Okay. Do you have any messages to people who are coming up with starting a career in writing, or students?
Anybody who's beginning to work, an old friend, a writer here in the city, Radimus Ortiz, the one greatest piece of advice I ever got from him, and I still use today, and will repeat it until I'm blue in the face, is remember that regardless of whatever rejections come your way, whatever the negative things that occur that people speak at you, to you, about you, that you still created something, and that's the validation. It's not the accolades, it's not the awards, it's not the performances, it's not the publishings. It's that you sat down and created something that somebody else didn't take the time to do. And that in and of itself should be rewarded.